Hello and welcome to the Be Formless Flow Driven CEO and VC podcast, where we are reshaping life, leadership, business, and investing. And today I am welcoming to the show, all the way from North Carolina, Richard Samuelson. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. How is everything in North Carolina? You said it's a beautiful Friday evening.
Yes, weather's lovely this time of year. So you can sit outside, have dinner, sip cocktails. It's wonderful.
I love the vibe of having a Friday night cocktail. What's your cocktail of choice?
I start with beer. I probably end up with bourbon.
There you go. Well, that's fascinating. Thank you for coming on my show, and hello to all the listeners out there. Richard has been very persistent and patient with me because there's been a few times that we've attempted to have Richard on the show, and for unforeseen reasons, here we are now, finally. So, Richard, thank you again. I do like somebody who has great patience and persistence, and it's a good segue because we are going to talk a little bit about, we're going to talk about both really today in terms of what you do and also your journey, and I'm really looking forward to it. So let's get on into it. You're a venture capitalist and you're a co-founder of SWAN Venture Group, which you co-founded, I should say, in 2019. Interesting, right on the cusp of COVID. And like even now, COVID is just it's like almost like COVID is what? Like we're in this AI revolution now. So it's like it doesn't even make sense anymore. Anywho, Richard Samuelson, your work sits in the space between old world capital and emerging innovation. And I love that. You help navigate the relationship between Japanese institutional investment and the fast moving realities of the US startup ecosystem. And I know from my own experience working with Japanese companies, it's vastly different. And I'm interested in your whole view on it. A background in Japanese equities at UBS Securities, you've spent years observing how different cultures approach risk, growth, trust, and long-term value creation. And obviously that experience now shapes the work you do through the SWAN Venture Group. And that's where you focus on building investment relationships that extend beyond transaction and into long horizon. What I say is alignment. Your perspective brings attention to something often overlooked in venture. And this is something I've been talking a little bit around of recent with a lot of people I've been interviewing. And that is that capital is never just money. It carries mindset, history, expectations, and deeply embedded ways of thinking about control, patience, and progress. Across your work is an ongoing exploration of what becomes possible when fundamentally different investment philosophies learn to move together, and then what tensions emerge when they don't. So, Richard, I'm really looking forward to getting into this conversation. I'm going to hand it over to you. Tell us a bit about your journey. Off you go.
Thank you very much, B. Let me start with this. If I were to contrast Japanese institutional priorities versus other typical venture capital investors, they most prize access to technology. That's the primary motive for investing in early stage companies in the US or elsewhere. Of course, the US gets the bulk of their attention. That's a consistent theme you find almost across the board. They're interested in accessing the technology first, and the returns, I won't say they're secondary, but they're almost indifferent as to whether they're high or they're low. If they get access to the technology that they want, they can apply it from their perspective, often in many different markets or applications. And so we are aware of that. And one of the services we have provided Japanese institutions on the back of that is research on what early stage companies are doing in the United States, most particularly on the West Coast, because that's where they pay most of their attention, frankly. It's on West Coast early stage companies. And
why is that, Richard? Sorry, why West Coast? Like is it why?
Well, it's much easier for them to communicate and visit directly with those companies. It really comes down to that kind of practicality. A lot of the technology companies and software, particularly, are concentrated on the West Coast, frankly. And Japan's a very technological country. So access to that kind of expertise, to AI technologies, to SaaS technologies, that's very high in their priority list. We sponsor regular conferences along with the Department of Commerce of the state of Washington to actually bring Japanese institutions over to the West Coast to meet with early stage companies. Have 10 early stage companies pitch at a time. And we also allow for a mutual pitch. In other words, the Japanese institutions pitch what they're looking for to a U.S. early stage audience. So
Yeah, right. Okay.
the intent is to foster mutual exchange. And one of the
I
things
like that.
one of the things this has led to is actually an incubator in Everett, Washington, which is sponsored by Shin Nippon Bio. They were one of the customers of our research, and they became so interested that they set up a large facility in Everett where they house U.S. early stage companies. Now, they're concentrated in health tech and biotech and med tech, to be sure. And that does embrace a certain amount of software. But they've allocated a corporate venture capital fund of $40 million to invest in
Wow.
selected companies, which they co-manage with Plug and Play, which is kind of a online conferencing facility for early stage companies to pitch 3-minute pitches, and also SBI, which is a unit of SoftBank. So we've fostered this development, and it's led to something that's quite unique, actually.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. How
so
did you, Richard? Oh, sorry, you go. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. So another element of what we've tried to do is foster agreements and investments, obviously. But what's interesting is that the Japanese institutions don't view access to early stage companies as simply a means to invest. They're looking for distribution agreements. They're looking for sales agreements. They're looking for tech transfer. They look at the access to early stage technology in a very complete sort of way.
Yeah.
We are aware of that, and because of our efforts, something like $30 million plus in deals have been realized because of these conferences that we sponsor with the Department of Commerce. And they've taken the form of distribution agreements, they've taken the form of investments, they've taken many forms
Yeah, it's
because
fascinating.
Japan. Yes.
No, I was going to say it's fascinating, and I'm listening to you, and because I have, like I said to you, I've worked with Japanese companies, and we were acquired by a Japanese company. I love that you're bringing the like everything you're talking about comes back to culture, right? In terms of understanding the nuances of the Japanese, how Japanese do business, how the US do business, and you are you're essentially crafting a value exchange that that addresses both cultures in a really unique way that brings them together in a really unique way, where business is done in terms of, like you say, distribution or investment. And it's a very, not anyone can do what you're doing, because if, like, when you're dealing with Japanese, and I love the Japanese, they do business very differently to, say, the Australian market. And it was really interesting for me when I first started working with Japanese, with Asahi, and exactly an understanding. And I was saying to you and giggling before, yes means no. So you do so much due diligence. You're just like, you think you've got a yes, and then it's like, no, there's another step, and there's another step. And I'll hand it back to you. But it's really, it's really profound what you're doing, because for all the listeners out there, we might think the way we do business in our country or wherever we are, everyone's just the same. It doesn't work that way. And I think you've got to have a real ability to listen, understand. Do you know what I mean? I'll give it back to you, Richard.
Uh, let me put it this way. I worked in Japan for a number of years. The Japanese, and I'm not the first to say this, they value relationships, and they value
Yeah.
trust, and they don't really
Yes.
want to do business with people they don't trust. There's,
Yeah.
to be quite frank, there's kind of a drinking culture behind that. They really don't feel they know you
Yeah.
until you've gone out and have
Ham
drinks.
pie.
That's fine. I was an athlete. I know how to do that.
beer drinker, Richard, and I had to try and keep up with Asahi when I was over there. I was like, oh my goodness, any more can buys. I was like,
But we're aware of that, and one of the reasons I think we're able to address that challenge as effectively as we do is we've got team members in Tokyo, we've got team members in San Francisco, where a lot of the Japanese plant small offices to track cutting edge technology. They'll send a couple of representatives over to Silicon Valley to track. So we keep one representative there. We have two in Tokyo. I'm here in the US. And so we communicate on a weekly basis on what's going on in all the locations. And what's interesting is by being persistent, and this is another thing the Japanese really value, persistence. They want you to
yeah,
keep coming back and asking over and over and over again. And ultimately, they take you seriously. And so this has led now to a situation where we're being approached by Japanese companies who want to list on NASDAQ. Early stage Japanese companies. So somehow word has gotten around in Tokyo that this organization is very well connected into the U.S. capital markets and can assist smaller Japanese companies with breaking into, potentially a listing on NASDAQ or a relationship with a U.S. company. And so I found that very interesting. That's unexpected. That's not anything we tried to cultivate. Our focus has been on exclusively on large institutions, large banks, large industrial companies, large biotech companies, pharmaceuticals, and so forth. But somehow, interestingly enough, in Japan, the word has gotten around to the smaller companies who are now approaching us directly about that.
yeah. It's fascinating, but it makes sense because you called out trust, you called out persistence. The big thing that comes up for me also is respect. And I think once you gain the respect, just like any business relationship, right? In my opinion, AI will never ever like create the relationship as such. It'll always be down to the humans, down to, the way you, I guess, engage, the value exchange you have. And for me, being curious is what you're talking about here in terms of like you keep going back and asking more. And I think that's part of business and that's what we should all be like, right? And so for me, respect is a big thing. And obviously respect is a big part of the Japanese culture. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from that, across, other cultures in terms of at times business deals can be so transactional and it's like that's not a long-term, that will never become a long-term relationship. So listening to you, I get why you're now being, getting calls from, the smaller businesses in Japan because respect is a massive part of who they are and what they're made up of. Do you think there's a lot to learn from that still with regards to, I mean, you've obviously been playing in the Japanese market for many years and you'd know it very well. Can you speak fluent Japanese, by the way?
I speak perfect taxi Japanese.
What do you see? What are the biggest differences you notice, like between, and I'm not going US versus Japan as such. What do you see as the biggest differences when it comes to, business in that regard in terms of, I guess, what am I asking here? The way the Japanese operate versus the way the US operate. What are the similarities and what do you see as the biggest differences and opportunity to, I guess, be better in business, if that makes sense?
Well, I would say this, the Japanese institutions we deal with are very cautious about revealing their intentions. They
Yeah.
much prefer, on a confidential basis, to communicate with an entity in the US that will keep their focus, technological focus, or institutional focus confidential and will feed them information that is unique. So they
Okay.
value unique access to information. Not that US and other companies don't, they do, but I think, actually the competition amongst the large Japanese conglomerates is so intense, partly because they compete on so many levels and in so many businesses. There are many more conglomerates in Japan than you find in the US
Mm,
and likely Australia as well.
yeah.
It's they're very sensitive to um, any of their Japanese competitors getting some sort of advantage relative to what they're doing, and they see access to information as a key part of whatever advantage they can retain.
Yeah. Okay.
When we're aware of that, we also, I call it on the back end of the transaction. We don't simply stop at getting Japanese investment or a sales distribution agreement or something like that. We also, when one of our portfolio companies has matured to the point where they might be acquired, we make sure that our communications with interested Japanese parties are consistent. That doesn't mean a transaction happens overnight by any means. It just means that we make sure that our network of Japanese investors are aware that we have an asset, a company we know very well that could be a potential acquisition partner. Uh,
Yeah. Okay.
and that's how we make our money. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What I find interesting is because I've been to Tokyo about 8 times, I think. Yeah, like I love Tokyo. It's one of my most favorite cities in the world. And you get there and it just feels like another world in terms of, like calling out innovation, the tech, etc. And just, I come back to Australia and I'm like, I love Australia. However, I'm just a little bit like, oh, some of the things you can do in Tokyo and Japan, Tokyo, etc. I don't know why I said Tokyo, Japan. It's interesting for me though, in terms of, and I'm intrigued. A lot of like what you're doing with regards to the Japanese institutional capital and deploying it into the US startup ecosystem. Who is more innovative? Like, I mean, like because I always saw Tokyo, and again, this is not a competition. But it's fascinating that they're obviously then, like really focused on the West Coast. I mean, obviously the Silicon Valley, etc. Is there a lot of innovation happening in Tokyo or in Japan as such, or do you think that it's an assumption, like because of the way the country is? Like I don't know, like it's just really interesting for me that what I've seen in the labs that I've been in, and even from a media perspective, and with like I said with Dentsu, some of the innovation back then that we'd go into the creative labs and what I was seeing, I was like, oh, whoa, this is like 10 years, 20 years in advancement. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious.
Well, in some sense, I think the U.S. is complementary to what Japan's doing. Japan's very strong in processing, manufacturing, in many ways better than the United States and more cost effective. In other areas, obviously AI is one. Another, it would be, blockchain technologies. The US and other countries are ahead of Japan as the inventors of these
Yeah,
technologies.
that's a good call
So
out.
in specific technologies, Japan is hungry to learn.
Yeah,
That they don't see where the future is. It's a situation where those technologies weren't native to Japan, but they clearly see the rewards and the impact that these technologies where the US is at the forefront, like AI and blockchain, are going to have a tremendous worldwide impact. And the last thing they want is to be left behind by the likes of Korea or China or someone else. So
yeah,
they're very competitive in that respect.
yeah. Okay. Tell me a little bit about. We had a brief conversation, and I am jumping around here. That's part of the formless conversation here. What are you seeing in terms of the startup ecosystem, founders, women, especially for from a Japanese perspective, business perspective, and then obviously from a US, what are you seeing in terms of the conversations I've been having of recent, women, in leadership roles, founders, from a VC perspective, even from a CEO perspective? What are you seeing? What are you noticing? And where are you seeing gaps and opportunities?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. So we've got a couple of companies in our portfolio that are AI adjacent or AI specific. One deals with manufacturing, another deals with the blockchain. And I find that Japanese institutions are kind of indifferent as to whether it's a male or female running the company. They want the technology. Well, I think they've gone past having reservations
That's
about
good.
female leadership. I don't know to what degree that applies in Japan itself, but with respect to acquiring new technologies, it doesn't seem to be a barrier. It's not a question they ever ask when we talk to them.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, I mean, to that extent,
Yeah, it's good.
yeah, anyone's fair game or any company's fair game.
Yeah, totally. In terms of then the founders, like what are you seeing? We're in a revolution in terms of AI. You could argue maybe we're not, it's no different to any other revolution we've had when it comes to tech. What are you seeing as the biggest challenges right now that founders are facing in terms of in the startup ecosystem? And especially like with regards to in your funds, like what do you notice? Like I called out mindset is a big part of obviously, business and, playing the long game, if you like. And we mentioned that in your bio. How important is it, like in terms of mindset and, where are the founders at in your funds at the moment? Like, what are you seeing?
Well, I think in years to come, one of the tragedies of this era will be the degree to which capital uh, was skewed toward AI to the exclusion of other technologies. It's not that AI isn't important,
Mm,
but I wouldn't be the first to say that the valuations are absolutely peak levels.
yeah,
The amount of capital, I hear various or read various figures. 70% of early stage funding is going into AI. It may not be quite that high at the moment, but it's certainly over 50% that we're seeing is skewed toward AI at the expense of other very promising
technology.
technologies. I'm thinking material science. There are very important material science technologies that
Yeah.
are neglected. Blockchain gets some of it, but not nearly as much as AI, and that's kind of a world changing technology too. And there are many others. So uh, I don't think it's so serious that non AI technologies get no money.
Mm,
It's just that they're not awarded the same valuations. They're not experiencing the same lucrative exits. They're particularly in the later stages, attracting the big institutional venture capital companies
yeah.
the way AI is. And that's a lot of the money. Early stage money is always thin. Late stage money is generally fat, and
Mm,
that's concentrated. And there may be a price to pay for that. There may be underdevelopment in non AI related technologies because of a relative lack of funding. Some of that's made up by public funding, by particularly the NIH or the U.S. military or what have you, or other governments, world governments that are funding these technologies. But it's hard to replace, uh, the volumes of private capital that go into AI at the expense of other opportunities.
Is it going to calm down anytime soon, do you think? Or do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better, like in terms of what you've just been talking about? Do you like, it feels like every day you wake up, and I just woke up this morning to, you can't help yourself. You've signed up to so many different, and you're just reading all this new technology from an AI perspective, or this has just been the platform you've got, even from an operational tools perspective, it's now this, it's now that. Like, it's just every day. It's like, "Oh, here we go again." Like, it's complexity on steroids, if you like, for me at the moment in terms of there's so much out there. And then there's almost like, for me, it's just so much hype that I feel like, even from a business and a founder perspective and what you're talking about here, you could easily get, I guess, deflated, if you like, if you're not an AI specific, startup. And there's also like a lot of hype around like how many of these businesses will actually, if we come back to short term versus long term value creation, etc. Yeah, so I just think we're at a really interesting point in time
Well,
because
I can't
everyone can
imagine.
say, yeah,
Yeah, I can't imagine anything but a painful outcome for most of the investors. There
yeah,
will be winners, and
yeah,
the sorting out obviously hasn't happened yet.
yeah,
The number of winners will be limited.
yeah.
If I were to guess, 90% plus of the AI competitors out there will not fare very well. So, the shakeout, I would have expected it to start by now. It hasn't.
No, it feels like it keeps going. Like it
Yeah,
feels like
right.
it's just going like this.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So
So,
why is Richard? Oh, sorry, you go.
no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Richard, like listening to you and like obviously with regards to the way you work with the Japanese and the US and bringing them together, if you like, when you think about long-term relationships and then what you're talking about here, feels like, correct me if I'm wrong, and like there's a lot of short-term reactive investor business deals happening at the moment and like in terms of let's jump on this because it's AI, it could, could become a unicorn, it may not. What's changed with the investors to have that? Has it always been this sort of reactive way of operating, or are you noticing that it's actually becoming more reactive than ever, like in terms of just these, you've talked around, I guess, there's so much focus in AI at the moment and so much being poured into it to the detriment of other, sectors, for example. Is it because everyone's just thinks this is like they have to jump on? Is it pressure? What is it?
We're definitely at the feeding frenzy end of the cycle. The cycle
Yeah,
is a cycle.
yeah,
So
yeah,
when the cycle passes, there'll be a lot of heartache, and that lies ahead.
yeah,
Exactly when is hard to say, maybe the next 2 years. And it's very difficult to know what will be the trigger. Often it's a seemingly unimportant geopolitical event or a bankruptcy, a sudden bankruptcy or something. And then suddenly the house of cards falls as it has so many times before. I don't think it can be that much longer before an event like that is triggered. Tech earnings in the United States are still growing very strongly as they have been, but it's very, very concentrated.
mm,
It's really driven by a fairly limited number of names. Those kinds of situations historically, we've seen it before actually, where certain industries achieve very, very high valuations and the stock market's concentrated in a sector or two. And then an event happens and suddenly the, uh, the exuberance fails and
yeah,
the valuations come back to normal. And because it's so concentrated, the value is so concentrated in a handful of names, the risk of a very substantial decline in the overall stock market is large. So
yeah.
we're in a riskier situation than normal because valuation isn't spread across a large
No,
universe of
it's
companies.
concentrated. Yeah, it's fascinating. Haven't had this conversation yet with anyone on my pod. I'm conscious it's your Friday evening. I have a couple of final questions for you. And when I was talking about you and, that your work across is an ongoing exploration of what becomes possible when fundamentally different investment philosophies learn to move together. What came up for me earlier, and I wrote it down, was Kaizen in terms of the philosophy of Kaizen. And I guess it's such a beautiful philosophy. And do you apply that in terms of the way you do business with regards to how you work with the Japanese and the US? Is that something that comes into play for that very reason of I feel like with Kaizen, anything can become possible when you have that sort of, I guess, way of partnering, way of operating, if that makes sense.
Well, I would put it this way. One has to be sensitive to what the Japanese investor is interested in and deliver it, call it in a timely fashion. So maybe there's a parallel there. I think it's hard to understand the Japanese business culture unless you've really lived there or you've worked a lot with Japanese businessmen directly.
Mm.
It's not the sort of thing you learn in books.
No.
And one advantage I have, which I brought to business in Tokyo, is I was a judo player for many, many years. And
Wow, there you
yeah,
go.
so uh, I knew the culture, call it the chivalric culture of Japan quite well. And I even practiced at the Budokan in Tokyo and many Japanese players and competed against them and so forth. Um, it gives you a bit of a leg up to have that kind
Yeah,
of involvement with a core Japanese cultural trait and a core Japanese cultural institution like that.
yeah. And I should say to everyone, sorry for the listeners, Kaizen is like is the philosophy is in business is continuous improvement. And I think, with continuous improvement, it's anything can become possible because you're continuously, like improving, right? Okay, final question for you, Richard. What is my final question for you? I want to throw something into the mix where you're like, will be, what was that? If there's one thing that the total VC ecosystem could be doing better now, like when it comes to culture, let's throw culture in the mix. What would it be? Like what would you like to see as a collective within the ecosystem that everyone does better? And if you think about it from a conscious perspective, because I talk a lot about conscious capital, yeah.
Well, I would like to see more attention paid to non-fashionable technologies. So let me give you one example. There's a technology surrounding carbon nanotubes that deserves far more attention than it gets. Just by way of background, carbon nanotubes are considered one of the strongest types of structures known to man. The tensile strength is many times that of steel. It has other remarkable characteristics. It's a superconductor. So, for example, you could conceivably use carbon nanotubes for sending electrical and power signals across distances without any deterioration in the signal at all. So I won't go into all the characteristics of carbon
Yeah.
nanotubes here, but the amount of money and attention paid to a technology like that is de minimis compared to AI or even blockchain or a number of other technologies. And someday the world will have cars made of carbon nanotubes, and they'll be a tenth the mass of a car today. So we won't see it anytime soon, but if enough capital were deployed and enough intellectual resource was deployed in a technology like that, you could see remarkable changes on the back of it.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah. The big call out is like it's look up and look around because it's not just, we're in this like AI bubble at the moment. However, there is so much more out there. And, when we look outside, the possibilities are endless, like you say. So I love ending on that note. Richard, thank you so much for your time. How do we find out more about Swan Venture Group? How do we find out more about you?
You can reach me at rs dot swan uh, rs.
I've got that, and I've got it in the show notes as well. What's on the go for the weekend, Richard? You're heading into it. What any good plans coming up this weekend?
Yeah, my daughter's going horseback riding tomorrow, and we're taking my son to visit Erskine College.
How good. Sounds lovely. Well, on that note, enjoy your weekend. I love that you're having some family time. It's always a joy. I'm heading off to take my little 2-year-old puppy down to the local beach near me, and we're going to go and just soak in the sunshine and get back to being present. So it's been a really lovely conversation with you today, Rich. Thank you so much for your time. Super insightful. love how you are so culture first when it comes to business relationships, and it's so important. So thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, B. Nice to see you. Bye bye.
You too. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye bye.